This series is called The Most Notorious Serial Killer from each state. This list was updated as recently as October 30th, 2020. When the Golden State Killer was caught in 2018, more than 3 decades after his crimes, the country was stunned. But these horrific murders are not unfamiliar to Americans. In fact, the United States has had more serial killers than any other country. As early as the 1800s, the United States has seen killers who murdered on a massive scale. Since then, the country has become captivated with true crime, particularly serial killers. Shows like Netflix's Mindhunter or books like I'll Be Gone in the Dark try to get into the minds of the terrifying killers to learn about motives and tactics. Here's a list of men, women, and yes, even families who were serial killers in every state across the United States. Warning: some of these accounts can be upsetting to some and describe graphic details of real-life cases. Listening discretion is advised. Alabama, Thomas Warren Wisenhant. In October 1976, Thomas Warren Wisenhant abducted Cheryl Lyon Payton from the convenience store where she worked. He drove her to a secluded area and sexually assaulted her in the front seat of his pickup truck. He then shot her point blank in the head and dragged her body into a wooded area. A few days later, Wisenhant returned to her body and mutilated it. When he was caught, he told the police everything about Payton's murder and even confessed 2 other murders. The death of Honora Hyatt and Patricia Hitt. He was put to death in 2010. Alaska, Robert Hansen. Alaska has more serial killers per its population size than any other state, according to HuffPost. So although it's hard to choose just one killer that terrorized the state, Robert Hansen seems to leave a really bone-chilling scare. Hansen appeared to be the model father, husband, and business owner, but he was harboring a terrible secret. He was hunting women like wild animals. In 1971, he started to abduct sex workers and strippers and bring them to his remote cabin in the woods where he would torture them. He let them loose in the woods of Anchorage and then he'd hunt them down for mere pleasure. When finally caught, Hansen confessed to murdering 17 people, but was only convicted for 4. He died in prison in 2014 at 75. Arizona, Mark Goodall, the Baseline Killer. Mark Goodall became known as the Baseline Killer when he terrorized the Phoenix, Arizona community in the summer of 2006. He would attack women during their daily lives. One woman he brutally raped and murdered when she was vacuuming her car. Another woman met a similar fate when she was just waiting at a bus stop. They were all found in pools of blood with their pants pulled halfway down. In total, Goodall was found guilty of killing 9 people, most of them women. In 2016, his 9 death sentences were upheld in Phoenix. He is still in prison. Arkansas, the Phantom Killer. Although this killer was never identified and spanned 2 states, the Phantom Killer earns his spot on this list for the terror he caused in 1946. Every 3 weeks to the day, this murderer would shoot a couple to death in their car. Eventually, movie theaters canceled shows, people stayed inside behind locked doors, and very few ventured outside. The town of Texarkana, which spanned Texas and Arkansas, lived in fear, as he apparently attacked 8 people and killed 5. Just as fast as the killing started, they suddenly stopped. The Phantom Killer was never identified, but the terror he left in the small town was never lost, ultimately inspiring the classic horror film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. California, Ed Kemper. Ed Kemper is a particularly brutal serial killer who killed 10 young people, earning him the title, the Co-Ed Killer. Before earning this moniker, he killed his grandparents at 15 and was in jail for 2 years. In the early 70s, Kemper started to pick up young hitchhikers who were Fresno State students. Eventually, he escalated to killing them and cutting their heads off. On some occasions, he would have sex with the corpses. Right before he was caught, he killed his mother by smashing her head with a hammer and decapitating her. He was found guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. He is currently serving his sentence in prison. Colorado, Scott Lee Scott. Scott Lee Kimball is an FBI informant turned serial killer. In 2002, he was in jail for fraud and convinced the FBI to let him out as an informant. During those years free from jail, he killed 4 people. Kimball killed his uncle, his cellmate's girlfriend, and a 19-year-old girl. Kimball was the last to see all of them alive. After a brutal car chase, Kimball was arrested and pled guilty to 4 charges of second-degree murder. He is currently serving a 70-year sentence. Connecticut, William Devin Howell. William Devin Howell can be best described as a drifter. In 2003, he roamed the streets of Connecticut in his van that he dubbed his Murder Mobile. The name makes sense because, at the time, Howell abducted, assaulted, and murdered 7 people, according to Oxygen. He buried the bodies in his garden behind a strip mall as a memorial. On trial, Howell said he could not explain his motive behind the killings, referencing a monster inside him. "I know everyone wants to know why I committed these crimes. I don't have an answer. I do not know myself," he said at the time. In 2017, he was sentenced to 360 years in prison. Delaware, Stephen Brian Pennell. The state of Delaware only has one documented serial killer, Stephen Brian Pennell, or more commonly known as the Route 40 Killer. Between the years of 1987 and 1988, Pennell preyed on the sex workers who worked on Route 40. He'd pick them up in his electrician van. As the bodies began to pile up, investigators struggled to find the culprit. All they had for clues were blue carpet fibers on the body, WHYY reports. Eventually, an undercover cop was picked up by Pennell, and she noticed his van was covered in blue carpet. The investigators had their guy, a seemingly harmless man who was a father, a husband, and an electrician. He was found guilty of murdering 2 of his victims. During his sentencing, Pennell bizarrely asked to be put to death. However, he never admitted to the crimes. He died of lethal injection in 1992. Florida, Christine Falling. While Florida has seen the likes of Eileen Wuornos and Ted Bundy, one unknown serial killer makes this list for her brutality. Christine Falling became known as the babysitter from hell when she choked and killed 5 children in the early 80s, including an 8-month-old baby. She was just 19 years old when she murdered the children. She pled guilty and said she killed the children she babysat because she had to satisfy a sudden urge to choke them, according to the New York Times. She was sentenced to life in prison and is still there to this day. Georgia, Atlanta child murderer. Between 1979 and 1981, Atlanta was in a state of panic. Black children in the neighborhood were being targeted and murdered one by one. It became known as the Atlanta child murders. It is believed that Wayne Williams, a freelance photographer, may have been responsible for the murders. Wayne is in jail for 2 more murders and has never been tried for the Atlanta child murders, but there is evidence that points to him, including the fact that fibers from his home and dog were found on the victims. Some believe Williams has nothing to do with these crimes and think that police pinned them on him because they wanted an answer. There are those who also believe the KKK were the real murderers of these children, but the FBI found no direct link between the group and these murders. If true, Williams could be guilty of killing close to 30 people. Hawaii, Honolulu Strangler. When you think of Hawaii, you think of sunny beaches and peaceful islands. In the mid-80s, the tropical utopia was gripped with fear when 5 bodies were found near water. All 5 were women ranging in age from 17 to 36, Hawaii News Now reports. Each one of the bodies was found with their hands tied behind their back and some were sexually assaulted. Police believe the murders were acts of a serial killer, but could never find the culprit. The case remains open. Idaho, Lyda Southard, or Lady Bluebird. Lyda Southard makes the list because she's often credited with being Idaho's, and sometimes the country's, first woman serial killer. In the early 1900s, Lady Southard murdered her 4 former husbands, her brother-in-law, and ever her own daughter by poisoning. It's believed Southard murdered her husbands for insurance purposes. After she was caught, she was sentenced to 10 years to life in prison. After a notorious escape from prison, she later died from a heart attack. Her body was completely hairless, a side effect of exposure to arsenic. Illinois, John Wayne Gacy. Dubbed the serial killer clown, Gacy killed 33 boys and young men in the 70s. Since he worked as a clown performer for children's parties, he would often kill his victims while wearing the clown costume that he called Pogo the Clown. Gacy would sexually assault the boys, strangle them with rope, and then bury their bodies under his house. He was found guilty on all 33 counts of murder and was put to death in 1994. Indiana, Herbert Baumeister. Herbert Baumeister led a double life. He lived on a farm in Indiana with his wife of 25 years and had 3 children. What his wife didn't know was that Herb also cruised gay bars at night, picking up young men. Eventually, police started showing up at the Baumeister home asking questions about missing boys. They later found 11 bodies just 50 feet from his home. As the cops circled in on him, he panicked and died by suicide without ever facing trial. Iowa, Carol Edward Cole. Although Carol Edward Cole's crimes weren't committed in Iowa, he grew up in the state that seemingly shaped his life into a serial killer. While in Iowa, he lived with his mother, who would often beat him. There he grew to hate his mother and women as a whole. Between 1948 and 1980, Cole strangled and killed 13 women across multiple states because he said it felt like he was killing his mother, according to the Soy City Journal. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. He refused appeal because it would be unbearable to stay here any longer. He was executed in 1985. Kansas, Dennis Lynn Radar. Dennis Lynn Radar is better known by his other name, the BTK Killer. The letters stand for blind, torture, kill, and that is exactly what he did. He killed 10 people in Wichita between 1974 and 1991. What made him particularly noteworthy is the cat and mouse game he played with authorities. At each crime scene, he would leave a clue as to who he was. At one, he left a letter telling them he can't stop killing and gave himself the initials BTK. He is currently serving his 10 life sentences in prison. Kentucky, Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey is better known as the Angel of Death after he confessed to 57 murders. In the 1980s, Harvey was a nurse's aide working at hospitals in Kentucky and Ohio, and he killed dozens of patients using cyanide, rat poison, and arsenic, according to WXIX. Bottom line was, Donald Harvey liked to kill. William Whalen, Harvey's former attorney, wrote in a book. Harvey was convicted of 37 murders and sentenced to multiple life sentences. In 2017, he was beaten to death in prison. Louisiana, Clementine Barnabet. The story of Clementine Barnabet is that of voodoo and the occult. Barnabet killed entire families as they slept in what became known as the voodoo murders in the 1910s. 19-year-old Barnabet confessed to killing 17 people with an axe on behalf of the Church of Sacrifice. On her behalf, church followers killed upwards of 40 people. Although she confessed, she was not put to death because she was so young. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison. Maine, John Joubert. John Joubert once said that when he was young, he fantasized about killing his babysitter and eating her. In the late 70s, Joubert made his fantasies a reality when he killed 3 boys, strangling them and taking bites into each. 2 of his kills took place in Nebraska, when he worked with the Air Force, and the third happened in Maine when he abducted the 11-year-old boy who went out for a jog. When Joubert was caught, he said he was happy because he knew that he would kill again, according to the New York Daily News. He met his fate in the electric chair on July 17, 1996. Maryland, Joseph Metheny. In the 90s, Metheny would lure sex workers to his trailer to stab and strangle them, but it's what he did with their bodies that really shocked the nation. Turns out, Metheny also owned a food stand where he would mix the human flesh from his victims with animal meat and then sell it to his customers, according to The Sun. The human body taste was very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell the difference, he told The Sun in 2015. That's how he earned his name, the Cannibal. He was found guilty on 3 murder charges and was facing the death penalty, but in 2000 it was overturned to a life sentence. He died in prison. Massachusetts, the Boston Strangler. Between 1962 and 1964, Boston was plagued with a serial killer. 13 women were killed in their own homes. There was no sign of forced entry, so police believe each victim let their murderer in voluntarily. Despite the fact that some of the women were stabbed to death, the killer earned the name the Boston Strangler. His killing sparked a full panic in the small city. Albert DeSalvo confessed to all 13 murders, but his story didn't fully add up. He was eventually murdered in prison. The case of the Boston Strangler serial killer is still left unsolved. Michigan, Eli Abuelazam. He was known as the serial stabber because between 2009 and 2010, Eli Abuelazam stabbed 18 people in Flint, Michigan. Of those 18, 5 people were killed. His stabbings became national news when he crossed state lines to stab even more people. Some believe his stabbings were racially motivated because the majority of his victims were African American. He was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes and remains in prison. Minnesota, Paul Michael Stephanie. In 1982, Minnesota police received several phone calls from a man who was crying. He would call after every time he killed a person, confessing to murder. In the years to come, the weepy-voiced killer would be identified as Paul Michael Stephanie. Stephanie admitted to beating and stabbing 3 women between the years 1980 and 1982. He confessed to several other murders just before dying in prison, according to the Star Tribune. Mississippi, Glenn Rogers. In 1995, Glenn Rogers met Linda Price at the Mississippi State Fair and they shared a drink. Eventually, they moved in together. The day before Halloween, Price, a redhead, was found dead in the bathtub and Rogers fled the scene. Later, Rogers would be connected to 2 other murders of women with red hair and found slain in their bathtubs. Rogers became known as the cross-country killer for killing his victims across multiple state lines. In 2012, reports surfaced that Rogers may be the murderer of Nicole Simpson, not O.J. Simpson, but nothing ever came of it. He was convicted of 2 murders and sentenced to death. Rogers is currently on death row. Missouri, Terry Blair. Terry Blair first killed his pregnant girlfriend and mother of his 2 children in 1982. Since then, he raped and killed at least 7 other women during his time in Kansas City, Missouri, the Daily Mail reports. While on trial for his murders, he was described as being a cold, calculating killer determined to kill as many women who worked as sex workers. He was found guilty of 8 charges of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Terry is not the only member of the Blair family who has a murderous past. 5 other relatives, including his mother, were convicted of murder. This makes the Blair family one of the most murderous families in Missouri. Montana, David Meerhofer. In 1973, a 7-year-old girl in Michigan was abducted and strangled to death. Her killer cut up her body. That murderer turned out to be David Meerhofer, who confessed to 4 other murders during a 4-hour interrogation. They called him a mindless monster, according to the Argus Press. Meerhofer was one of the first serial killers to be identified using FBI's newly developed profiling system that helped catch countless other serial killers. He hanged himself in jail just hours after confessing. Nebraska, Charles Starkweather. Technically, Charles Starkweather is a spree killer, but that doesn't make him any less terrifying. In 1958, for 2 short months, Starkweather shocked the nation with his crimes. At just 19 years old, he killed 11 people. He scared everyone because he was killing with reckless abandon at random. There was no pattern or clear idea as to who would be next. He told authorities he started his killing spree because his parents did not approve of his girlfriend, according to the Wyoming History's website. Starkweather was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death. He was executed in 1959. Nevada, Gerald and Charlene Gallego. They had a deal. Charlene would kidnap the girls and lure them in with the false promise of safety. Gerald would then keep them as sex slaves, ultimately killing them when he was finished. By 1980, the couple killed 10 teenagers in Nevada and California. They were given the name sex slave killers. Once caught, Charlene turned on Gerald in return for a shorter sentence. Gerald was found and was sentenced to death in both California and Nevada, but died of cancer before he was executed. Charlene got out of jail in 2013 after serving a 16-year sentence. New Hampshire, Terry Petter Rasmussen. It's time to pin down Terry Petter Rasmussen. They called him the Chameleon because he went by so many names and aliases. In New Hampshire, he was known as Bob Evans, who killed 1 woman and 3 small children. He stuffed their bodies in barrels in the woods. In California, he was Gordon Jensen, where he killed 2 other women who were mothers of his babies. The body count rose across state lines as his list of aliases grew. Rasmussen was finally identified, but he had already died in prison, where he was serving time for different charges in 2010. New Jersey, Charles Edmund Cullen. Charles Edmund Cullen was the Angel of Death killer, and he killed upwards of 40 people over his 16-year career as a nurse in New Jersey. When patients would look for him to care during their darkest times, he would respond by killing them, usually with prescription drugs. In his confession, Cullen said he believed he was doing the community a service, helping these sick patients relieve their pain. During his 60 Minutes interview, he apologized for his crimes but said, "I don't know if I would have stopped." Cullen only confessed to the 40 murders, but investigators and experts believe his body count might reach the hundreds. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 11 life sentences. New Mexico, David Parker Ray. David Parker Ray bought a $100,000 trailer. Inside the trailer, he made a personal torture chamber, fitted with sex toys, handcuffs, whips, and chains. Ray would bring his victims to this chamber and torture them sexually before murdering them, according to the Albuquerque Journal. Ray would often record the torture on video. He called his truck the Toy Box, so he took on the name the Toy Box Killer. Sometimes, he let the women go after torturing them. For others, cut them into pieces and threw their bodies into lakes and ravines. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison, but he died in prison of a heart attack in 2002. New York, Joel Rifkin. In 1993, Rifkin was pulled over by police for not having a license plate. The police were suddenly struck by a smell escaping from the trunk of the car. The smell turned out to be Tiffany Bresciani's decomposing body. It was discovered that over 4 years, the Long Islander killed 17 women, most of them sex workers. He dismembered their bodies and disposed of all the pieces all over New York. He was found guilty of killing 17 women and was sentenced to 203 years in prison, which he is still serving. In an interview with the Daily News in 2010, Rifkin said, "I was surprised I didn't get caught sooner." Stay tuned for part 2 to the most notorious serial killer from each state.